I'm starting a road trip through 1,000 miles of the Midwest and 150 years of American history. And I'm starting in Chicago.
You guys are going to step out of the room and then to your left, enjoy the view. You're welcome.
I'm standing on the 103rd floor of the Sears building, which until recently was the world's tallest. And I want to talk about how getting rich went from moving sideways across the plains to moving upwards into skyscrapers. I want to talk about boundaries, how you establish them and how you enforce them. I want to argue that fencing, barbed wire fencing, changed the face of America, shut down the open range, killed the Wild West, and turned open access land into privatised space. We're next to the Lincoln Highway in DeKalb, Illinois. On the other side of the highway there's a filling station, and over there's a Burger King, and there's a coffee shop here. But in front of us there's this lovely brick-built, very modest American farmhouse on 2 stories, and this is the Joseph Glidden Homestead. And this is Marshall Wilson, the executive director. And this is the place, and here's the man. He is the man who invented barbed wire.
That's absolutely correct. He came up with the most economical to produce and the easiest to manufacture design of barbed wire in 1874, and it became the most widely used in the United States, and it's still manufactured today.
Do you have an idea of what Joseph Glidden was like as a man?
I think he was a really humble man. He was absolutely beloved in DeKalb. He was called Uncle Joe by everyone who knew him. He wasn't ostentatious. He didn't go out and build himself a big mansion. He just always had the town of DeKalb and its welfare at heart. He grew up in New York. He started out being a teacher, but he loved the land and he wanted to farm. So that's the reason he came out to Illinois. Of course, we have the best farmland here in the whole world.
He's the go west young man. He migrates to the west.
He worked his way west. He and his brother bought a threshing machine, and they threshed their way out here, and they saved their money, and that's what they bought the land with when they got out here. But we tell a story here about Brindle the family cow, because she was breaking out of her pen and she was trampling Mrs. Glidden's vegetable and flower gardens. And so she was saying, Joseph, you've got to do something about Brindle to keep her in her pen. Mrs. Glidden started missing the hairpins in her dish on her dresser. Lucinda just couldn't quite figure it out until one day at the dinner table, after dinner, Joseph sat back in his chair and he pulled a couple of hairpins from his pocket and he started fiddling with them. And Lucinda said, well, there are my hairpins. What are you doing with my hairpins? I'm just thinking, trying to figure out a fencing issue. I'm trying to solve this fencing problem we have. And here in DeKalb, we had 3 men who were working on the barbed wire fencing. And that was Joseph Glidden, Isaac Elwood, and Jacob Haish. Before Glidden actually got his patent, Elwood saw his design and asked to buy it. And Glidden didn't want to sell it, but he did offer to take Isaac Elwood in as a partner. He was a partner with Elwood only for a couple of years before Glidden sold out his half.
There's Glidden and Elwood, as against Haish, both of whom are claiming that they've got the patent for the manufacture of barbed wire.
Jacob Haish, who was kind of a hard-scrabble German, applied for his patent after Glidden, but it was approved before Glidden's patent. All the way to the Supreme Court it went, and it took many years of litigation, but Glidden was declared the inventor of barbed wire.
Many years and a lot of money.
A lot of money. We're told maybe $2 million, and that was in the late 1800s. So
the Glidden winner is what it's called.
It's called the winner, it is, and that's because of the Supreme Court decision.
And you can look at Crandall's Zigzag or Stubbs' Small Plate or Sunderland's Kink, And you think, no, that's... But when you look at Glidden's winner, you think, blimey, that's the stuff that I've got stuck on when I was a kid, trying to bunk into orchards.
That's the one that everybody
That's the one.
recognizes. It seems like that was really the one that was the most popular and the most widely used.
Yeah, it's really interesting that he comes across as this sort of very warm, well-loved guy who's invented this thing to help his wife. And the other Uncle Joe, Stalin, is one of the people who are building, camps surrounded by barbed wire.
Our president of our board of directors here, she's been president for 4 years now, she said something that I thought was really odd at the time. She said she loved volunteering here because it was a happy use for barbed wire. Well, then when I came to work here, I learned her background and I found out that she's from the Soviet Union. And it made sense then, because I don't really think of barbed wire equated with prisons and concentration camps. But of course, there are communities in Europe, maybe that's the first thing that you would think of.
Yeah. The idea that barbed wire would become a mechanism for war or a means of controlling large groups of people, from the Boer War to Camp X-Ray, never entered the heads of Joe Glidden or his partner Isaac Elwood. Nor could they have dreamt of the riches it would bring them. So this is Elwood House in DeKalb. It reminds me of the Addams Family house. It's your classic American Gothic. I've got the tune playing in my head. And they started building this in 1879. Within 5 years, these guys were starting to generate a lot of money.
Absolutely. Certainly one of the grandest homes in DeKalb at the time, and one of the first to have indoor plumbing and eventually electricity. One of the first homes in DeKalb to have those amenities.
I'm with Scott Tews at the Elwood House, and in we go. What? Look, this is madness. Look at this. It's lined with marble straight away. That's just money. The money these guys must have had from nothing, from nowhere.
Absolutely. Certainly weren't shy about showing off some of the wealth that they had in the home.
What I'm getting is opulence.
Absolutely.
I think that's the only word.
That's I think the perfect word. I think opulence is a great word for it. So it certainly would have been one of the places to be if you could get invited to a party at the Elwood House.
Yeah.
This is our barbed wire history exhibit called Fencing Frontiers, the Barbed Wire Story. That first year of production, they were making things largely by hand. Over the next 5 years, the company was able to receive patents for machines that could help them mass produce. So in 1874, about 10,000 pounds of barbed wire were produced.
That's 32 miles, according to the...
And by 1880, just 6 years later, that total was over 80 million pounds of barbed wire.
263,000 miles.
So to give you an idea of how quickly this industry really took off.
Because everybody needed it.
Farmers and some of the homesteaders needed it not only for their property in the middle of the United States, but also railroad companies at that time became another major buyer of barbed wire to fence their right away to keep their tracks clear. So just a huge demand.
And you can see that railway thing in this beautiful advert, the Glidden steel barbed wire, Victorian picture. There's the railway just exactly as we imagine it, with the cow catcher on the front. And here are all the poor old cows not allowed to get under the
absolutely.
tracks. Lasts twice as long as any other kind of fence. Sparks do not set it on fire. Floods do not sweep it away. Its merits commend it as the best fence in the world. You can't argue with that, really.
Right.
Tell us about Better Million.
Oh, John Gates was a young salesman, about 21 years old at the time when this barbed wire industry is really taking off.
Better Million Gates. How come he's called Better Million?
He went to Texas as sort of a brash salesman, and in San Antonio around 1880, he basically started taking wagers. That this wire that he was trying to sell, he said, you take the strongest Texas Longhorn cattle that you can find, put them in this pen, and I'll take bets that this fence will be able to restrain even these animals. He takes all these bets, and the fence does hold up against these cattle, and it's really the way that he convinced some people that this wire was something worth investing in.
These are whopping great big factories,
Yep.
aren't they? I mean, they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 big chimneys smoking out. And there's a picture here of barbed wire being made. Is the factory still here?
It's not. The factories aren't in downtown DeKalb anymore.
Been knocked down.
Unfortunately. You're right.
It's a real shame that it's not made here anymore. But fortunately, before we came here, we went to see some barbed wire being made in England. On an old airfield with Peace Farmer, who's the managing director. This is Uniwire, just outside Tetbury in Gloucestershire.
This is your basic bog standard barbed wire.
In this huge hangar, there are 8 machines, each the size of a family car. They're like big knitting machines. Into each of them, a pulley on the ceiling is feeding 4 strands of galvanised steel wire, 2 to coil round and be snipped off at an angle to make the 4 pointed barbs, and 2 to twist together and lock the barbs into position. And then the finished wire coils out of the machine into a bright silver roll. I think it's lovely. I think these machines are amazing. I really do. Because presumably once this had to be made by hand, presumably, because this is a complicated bit of kit.
When it was initially invented, the barbs were actually put on by hand with a pair of pliers. But they didn't have the production rates we have.
No. So can a gentleman ask what your production rates are?
In an 8-hour shift, across the 8 machines, we can probably produce 250 rolls.
And what's that in terms of distance?
250 by 200 metres.
Yeah. And so that's 50 kilometres a day?
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah. That's a lot of barbed wire.
There's a lot of it used.
I've just worked it out on the back of an envelope. By 1880, the Elwood factory was making 30 times as much barbed wire every day as the Tetbury factory we've just visited. We're sitting in the shade of a tree beside the railway track, no gunny sack, no guitar. And this railway track coming through the middle of DeKalb, Illinois, on its way to Chicago, which is the centre of the American railway system. And this is one of the reasons why DeKalb happened to be at this particular time the centre of the barbed wire industry, because it was on the railway line, and it was also at the gateway to what seemed at the time an infinite west, infinite space. And as people went west, what comes behind them is fencing. What was previously not owned became owned, and you defined ownership with boundaries, and you make your boundaries with barbed wire fencing. That was the sound of me throwing a stone into the Mississippi River. We've driven maybe 3 hours due west from DeKalb and crossed the Mississippi. We're into the true west, and we've come to the little town of LeClaire, Iowa, and we've come across the Buffalo Bill Museum. This is Bob Schiffke.
Well, it's called the Buffalo Bill Museum because he was born just outside of LeClaire, Iowa, here.
So how did Buffalo Bill get his name?
They were building the railroad across the western part of the United States, and they hired him to provide meat for the workers on the railroad that were building the railroad. And of course, the meat was the buffalo. It's estimated that he shot, I think, close to 4,000 buffalo in 1 year's period. That's how he got his name. And then he became famous in the eastern United States because of this. But then in, I think it was 1883, he developed what called a Wild West show. Cowboys, Indians, of course, Indian battles, stagecoach robberies, sharpshooters, and so on, Annie Oakley. Some of it was a little bit, showmanship. I like to think of him as really probably the world's first superstar, when you come right down to it. And that's what he took to Europe in 1886, and again, I think in 1889,
And he came to Salford, in fact,
yes.
outside Manchester, where the BBC is based.
Okay.
On the site of Media City, Buffalo Bill held a show. So by the 1880s, in a way, the Wild West is being packaged up as a show, because it's quite a brief history, isn't it?
Yes.
It's such a short period of time.
Buffalo Bill lived, his lifespan pretty much went from prairies and open lands and Indians and so forth to the Indians being subdued and the white men taking over and the buffalo becoming nearly extinct, and into the barbed wire era. no more open plains. And in one lifetime, it's a big change.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah. And turning that life of adventure and pony express riding and being a scout into mythology, into a showman, into the world's first superstar, as you said.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a life.
Yeah, it was.
From the Mississippi River, I've driven all the way across Iowa, and today I've crossed into Kansas to meet Professor Paul Kelton at Kansas University to talk to him about how wire tamed the West. Who was here before the settlers came?
Indigenous peoples. In this particular area, the Kaw or Kansas Indians were here, as well as Pawnees and Osage.
And they didn't own the land in any sense, I guess?
Not in the sense of having a deed and boundaries marked out by fences, but certainly they claimed the land and they defended it with the use of violence.
So they valued their territory, their space.
Sure. And what it could provide for them in terms of food through hunting in this area, deer, and further out on the plains, bison, but also the river valleys in which they could farm.
They were farming. That idea that they somehow just lived off bison is something of a nonsense.
Yes, the river valleys were the most prized area to live because buffalo hunting before horses and guns was very difficult to do. They had been raising livestock in various forms probably for about 100 years.
So if people are coming here to settle, and it's already settled, how did that work?
The way U.S. Indian policy was geared, it was geared upon driving Native peoples into debt. Give Native peoples as many items as can be given so that they would not have enough to pay for these items except for their land. And so a lot of treaties that were presented to Native peoples were a way for the natives to pay off their debts. And some Native groups didn't even see the money. It went straight from the government into the pockets of the traders. They go into debt, and the hunting economy collapses because the changing nature of the land, where livestock comes in, fencing comes in, that puts an end to hunting. Hunting's not an option unless they want to move on somewhere else. Now, to say that this was all legal, you have to say yes, but there was in a lot of treaties, there was a lot of bribery, use of alcohol, intimidation, and again, that debt. And so there was force. Yeah, it was all done. There's a paper trail. It's all legal. It's more to it than that.
Once the Indians had been moved on down to Oklahoma or into reservations, the settlers could come. It was a free-for-all in theory, and the defining document is the Homesteading Act of 1862.
It was largely pie in the sky thinking that it was based on this belief that the West should be free and open for ordinary people. It was a very democratic piece of legislation based on the idea that no matter who you were, if you went and you occupied a spot of land, you worked hard, you could pull yourself up and achieve kind of middle-class status. You really can't make a living off 160 acres of arid land. So most people that would go west to try to, stake out their claim failed and ended up coming back east. It's one of those engines that drove westward expansion, in that this idealistic view of what the West promised for everyone. But in reality, westward expansion was more of a kind of a corporate, large-scale enterprise. You don't have westward expansion without these large-scale corporate enterprises, and the barbed wire industry is one of them. It's, like the railroads, it's like mining, it's like, the firearms industry, it's all these industries, heavy machinery. They all go hand in hand with America's westward expansion.
That, little house on the prairie, that's yet another myth. In fact, it's corporations on the prairie quite early on.
Quite early on. Especially as homesteaders fell and go back east and sell out their claim, and agribusiness comes in, bonanza farms, that really squeezes out the little guy and solidifies the corporate hold on the West.
So here I am outside the old railway station in Abilene, Kansas, next to the railway, with Laurie Hambright from the Tourist Information Centre in Abilene. Could you tell us something about how Abilene became the start of the Wild West?
Oh, certainly. A man named Joseph McCoy. He was a cattleman from Illinois. and he kind of was an entrepreneur, and he seen the need that there was cattle in Texas that had kind of ran and reproduced free and during the Civil War, and we had starving people in the East because they were fighting a war and couldn't produce food, and people were immigrating west. So he said, if I could get a railroad place, buy property, get a stockyards, get the cattle to the stockyards, ship them back east, we could solve some stuff, and I could be a good business person.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how that started. But he was responsible for really creating the first town of the Wild West. It's September 5th, 1867, the first load of cattle, longhorns, left Abilene.
It's the end of the Chisholm Trail and the cowboys come. Who was your marshal?
Oh, well, our most famous was Wild Bill Hickock. He brought enemies. He had enemies, so he was the one that had to watch his back. He was a very good sharpshooter. That is proven. He was the best shot.
Because Abilene was wild, wasn't it?
Oh, it was wild. You know when you bring any group of men that get paid off on payday and they have loose cash in their pockets, what do you think that attracts to a city?
Yeah.
It attracts all kinds of different business venues to take the money from them cowboys before they head back to Texas.
Yeah. But it's just in that very short period of time, because presumably, as the settlers came, they didn't want the cattle coming through so much.
No, you know, there was the fencing, just the settlement because of the immigrant. My family actually was farmers and cattlemen. And so we settled southeast of Abilene, and of course we were into breeding stock. My family has pulled Herefords. Herefords come from England.
Where I live in Herefordshire.
Oh,
Anyway.
awesome. So that's, my family has had Hereford cattle for 100 years in this county.
Yeah.
And so of course we didn't want injection of longhorns into our nice Hereford cow herd. So fences, here we enter barbed wire comes in, and of course Homestead, where you're homesteading a quarter a section, which is 160 acres of land.
Whoa! It's coming through.
Yes. Here comes our Union Pacific train.
When the settlers came, the fences came, and the cowmen, I guess, to Dodge City, I suppose, was next.
Well, actually Ellsworth. Ellsworth. But then after Ellsworth, it did kind of move to Dodge City, and that was well into the 1880s before really Dodge City became on the kind of the map of the Wild West. Abilene, after the cow town, almost dried up to nothing. You know, when the cowboys didn't come with ready money or had money in their pockets, the rest of the trade that followed them left. They actually packed up buildings and went on to Ellsworth, went on to Dodge City. You know, it was going to happen sooner or later, but it's just such a wonderful story that this was where the Wild West was born.
In 1885, the longhorn herds that had been grazing in the northern plains tried to head south for the winter. They hit barbed wire, couldn't get through, and 3/4 of them died in the snow. There are at least 2 barbed wire museums in the USA, one in Texas called the Devil's Rope Museum. That's what the Indian tribes used to call barbed wire, and one here at the Geographical Center of America in the little town of La Crosse, Kansas.
We'll come on in.
And on this site, we've also got the Post Rock Museum. Fence posts were carved out of limestone because there weren't many trees. And the man in charge here is Brad Penker.
Oh. And this is actually designed to show what a farmstead would have looked like in that era. This was someone's home, built out of limestone, and they actually dismantled the home from out on its original site and brought it to La Crosse and reassembled it back in the way it was when it stood out on the farm.
Would this have been the first thing that the settlers would have built?
Probably not. Sod houses were really the first thing and that's basically just built out of grass and dirt, soil. This house is very, very substantial. I mean, you know, it could stand up to the prairie fires which occurred out in here, a lot of the winds. The harshness of the environment, that's what made the stone houses so ideal.
What was it like, do you think, to string barbed wire on the post rock?
It's kind of hard to imagine. Just quarrying, getting the post set was a major undertaking. They would quarry the post, break it loose, back a wagon over the top of where it's set, put a rope around it, pick it up, haul it by wagon back to the site or back to the farm where you're going to put up your fence, dig a hole, move the wagon out of the way, stand the post up in the hole, and go through a half a mile of fence this way, setting the posts, and then go back and stretch the wire, and then take another short piece of wire and wrap it around the post and tie it to the barbed wire.
It marks the end, I guess, of that high period of the Wild West.
It really did. I mean, there's claims that say, you know, the barbed wire did settle the West, and definitely fencing off the territories and starting to give some semblance of civilization was what really made a lot of changes. It defined your territory, and it said, this is mine, this is my land.
And now, is there any open range left in Kansas?
Nothing in Kansas, no. Everybody's claimed their spot.
So, America, with the help of Joe Glidden, was sliced up and fenced off. Wilderness, the Everglades, the Rocky Mountains, the Nevada desert, big enough and empty enough to accommodate a nuclear explosion, these are no longer the world outside the wire. They're protected spaces, fenced off and held within the wire. And the same is happening all over the world. Today, in Africa, Asia, Australia and South America, nomadic hunters and herdsmen are losing their traditional culture and their livelihood to barbed wire enclosure. Once we all know who's got what land, now that's sorted out, what matters is what they're allowed to do with it, on it and to it. Do they have water rights, logging rights, mineral rights? Can they drill it, strip it, frack it? Do they have zoning rights? Can they build on it? What kind of building? How high? The higher you go, the more money you're squeezing out of the land you own. The land you fenced off with barbed wire. The fence that Better Million Gates described as lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dust. You should buy land, said Mark Twain. They're not making any more of it.